She owed $9,000 she had no plan to pay. Her name had been removed from the lease of the apartment she'd lived in for 6 years, and she was 51 years old, sleeping on a pull-out sofa in her younger sister's house. And every single morning, before anyone else woke up, she did one thing. Nobody knew about it. Nobody saw it. For weeks, it looked like nothing at all. But that nothing was quietly rebuilding a woman that the world had nearly finished erasing. I want to tell you her story, because I believe that somewhere in it, you are going to find a piece of yourself you thought you had already lost for good. And I want you to know, before we even begin, that it is not lost. It is just waiting for you to come back for it. Carol Simmons had been a school cafeteria worker for 19 years in a mid-sized city in the Texas Hill Country, in a town where everybody knew each other's cars and nobody quite knew each other's real lives. She was the woman who remembered which kids had food allergies without checking the list. She was the one who kept an extra tray warm for the boy in 3rd grade who was always late because his mother worked a night shift and mornings in that house were chaos. She was the one who noticed which teenagers came through the line looking hungry in a way that had nothing to do with food, and she would add an extra roll without comment, without making them feel seen in a way that stung. She had spent 19 years feeding other people's children. Her own daughter, Jasmine, was 24 and lived in Austin now, building a life that looked nothing like the one Carol had known, which Carol found both wonderful and quietly bewildering. Jasmine called on Sundays, reliably, and the calls were warm and real and 15 minutes long, which was enough, and also not quite enough, in the particular way that love across distance is always a little of both. Carol had been married twice. The first marriage ended when Jasmine was 4 and was not worth the words. The second marriage, to a man named Ray, had lasted 11 years and had been, in its best stretches, genuinely good. Ray was funny. Ray was present, mostly. Ray had a way of walking into a room that made it feel more occupied, more alive. But Ray had also borrowed against things he hadn't told Carol about, and when the financial unraveling finally arrived in full, it arrived all at once, the way water damage does, looking small on the surface until you pull back the wall and find the real extent of it. The divorce had been final for 8 months when our story begins. Carol's apartment was gone because her name had been on the lease jointly with Ray, and when Ray stopped paying the rent without telling her, the eviction process moved faster than she had understood eviction processes could move. She moved into her sister Gwen's pull-out sofa with 2 suitcases and a cardboard box of kitchen things, and the specific hollow feeling of a woman who has built a life twice and watched it come apart twice, and is standing in the rubble wondering whether a 3rd attempt is something she has the material for. Her small dream, the one she kept like a seed in her coat pocket, was a garden. Not a big one, a square of earth somewhere that was hers, where she could grow tomatoes and basil and the kind of peppers her grandmother used to grow in East Texas. She had never had a yard of her own. Every place she'd lived had been an apartment, but she carried that seed. She had not planted it yet. The one thing she gave herself every morning, in the gray quiet before Gwen's household woke, was a cup of coffee at the kitchen table, alone, in the stillness. That was hers. That was all that was hers. The full weight of what had happened with Ray did not arrive immediately. It came in stages, the way grief does, when you're too busy surviving to sit down with it. The first stage was practical, finding the sofa, talking to the school district HR about whether any of her sick days could be converted, calling the bank about the joint accounts she had not known were overdrawn, making a list of what she owed and what she had, which was a short list on one side and a longer list on the other. The second stage arrived on a Thursday afternoon in February. Emotional peak 1. The devastating discovery. Carol had gone to the bank to understand the full picture of the joint debt, because Ray had handled most of their finances, and she had let him because he'd said he was good at it, and because letting someone else manage something had felt, at the time, like trust, like partnership, The bank officer was patient and careful and used the kind of measured voice that people use when the information they are delivering is bad enough to require cushioning. What Carol learned in that meeting was that Ray had taken out a personal loan 18 months before the divorce, using documentation that included her signature, a signature she had no memory of providing, on a form she had no memory of seeing. The loan had defaulted. The debt was in both their names. $9,000. She sat in the chair across from the bank officer and felt the specific cold of a betrayal that has been hidden long enough to compound interest. She had not known. She had not known, and the not knowing was now her problem to solve. She thanked the bank officer. She gathered her papers. She walked to her car in the February parking lot and sat down and closed the door. She did not cry. She was past the kind of pain that comes out as crying. She sat there in the cold car and felt something that was closer to a clear, terrible understanding settling over her like weather. She had trusted someone with the architecture of her life, and he had taken a sledgehammer to a load-bearing wall and not mentioned it on his way out the door. The humiliation arrived at work, of all places, the one place she had always felt competent, purposeful, herself. The cafeteria had a new assistant principal that spring, a young woman named Ms. Herrera, who was efficient and well-meaning and had ideas about modernizing the lunch program. One of her ideas was a staff restructuring that reclassified several positions. Carol's position was reclassified from full-time to part-time with reduced benefits, effective the following school year. The meeting was brief and professional. Carol was told this was not a reflection of her performance. She was told she was a valued member of the team. She was given a pamphlet about adjusted benefits. She walked back through the cafeteria, past the serving line she had worked for 19 years, past the tables where hundreds of children had grown up eating food she had prepared for them, and she felt the particular invisibility of being someone whose years of service do not prevent the reclassification. She had been there 19 years. She had remembered the allergies and kept the extra tray warm and added the extra roll without making anyone feel small. And it had not protected her from being made smaller. She went to the walk-in cooler on her break and stood in the cold for 5 minutes because it was the only place in the building where she could be alone. And she pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes until the heat behind them passed. Then she went back out and finished her shift. By March, Carol had stopped eating real meals. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone noticed. She was still making coffee in the morning. She was still showing up to work. But somewhere in the middle of all of it, the actual business of feeding herself had gotten lost. She would have coffee and a piece of toast and then not think about food until 7 in the evening when Gwen put dinner on the table. And by then she wasn't really hungry, just hollow. She was sleeping 10, 11 hours on the weekends and waking up still exhausted. One Saturday morning in late March, she got up before anyone else as usual, made her coffee, sat at Gwen's kitchen table, and opened her phone to look at apartments. She did this sometimes, not because she was close to affording one, but as a kind of low-grade hope maintenance, the way you keep a plant alive not because you know where you're going to put it, but because you can't bring yourself to let it die. She found one listing she could almost afford, a studio, 30 minutes from work, ground floor, with a small fenced back area that the listing called a patio, but that looked, in the photographs, more like a patch of neglected earth. She looked at that patch of earth for a long time. Then she closed the app. She thought about $9,000. She thought about part-time hours starting in September. She thought about the pull-out sofa, which had a bar in the middle that she had learned to sleep around, but which woke her with back pain at least twice a week. She thought about being 51 years old with 2 failed marriages and a reclassified job and a debt she hadn't chosen and a sister who was kind about the sofa, but whose kindness had started to feel, in the most unfair and human way, like a mirror Carol couldn't stop looking into. She thought, I am going to be here forever, on this sofa, in this kitchen, drinking this coffee, looking at apartments I cannot afford. This is just what my life is. She put her forehead down on the kitchen table. She stayed there for a long time. Outside, a bird was carrying on about something in Gwen's backyard. Insistent, repetitive, completely indifferent to whether Carol was listening. She lifted her head. She looked at the window. The bird was on the fence post, small and brown, and absolutely certain of its right to be exactly where it was. She watched it for a while. Then she did something she had not done in 23 years. She got out a piece of paper from the notepad Gwen kept by the phone, and she wrote down, in her own handwriting, what she actually wanted. Not what was realistic, not what was possible given the circumstances. What she actually wanted. The list had 4 things on it. All of them felt impossible. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket, next to the seed she'd been carrying all this time, and went to make a second cup of coffee. The woman at the community garden plot sign-up table was not there by coincidence. Or maybe she was. That depends on what you believe. Carol had seen a flyer at the library. A small community garden was opening plots for the season. $20 for a 4x8 bed. Tools available on site. $20. She had $20. She was not sure she had anything else, but she had $20 and a piece of paper in her pocket with 4 things on it. And the first thing on that piece of paper was a garden. She went on a Saturday morning in early April. The table was set up near the entrance of the garden, and behind it sat a woman who appeared to be in her late 70s, wearing gardening gloves that were too large for her hands and a sun hat that had been re-ribboned in a bright yellow that did not match anything else she was wearing and clearly did not concern her. Her name was Vera. She had been one of the founding members of the garden 12 years ago. She explained as she wrote Carol's name in the ledger, and she came every Saturday to handle sign-ins because the young volunteers always got distracted and forgot to write down phone numbers correctly. Carol paid her $20. Vera gave her a plot number and a hand-drawn map of the garden. Carol said thank you and started to leave, and Vera said, without looking up from her ledger, "First time? At a community garden?" "Yes." "What are you planting?" Carol hesitated. "Tomatoes and peppers, if I can figure it out." Vera wrote something in the margin of the ledger. "What kind of peppers?" "My grandmother's kind. I don't know the name. Thin, red, a little wrinkled when they're ripe. She grew them in East Texas." Vera looked up for the first time. She had the kind of eyes that have looked at a great many things carefully for a long time. Unhurried, direct. "You know what you need," Vera said. "You just need somewhere to put it." Carol stood very still. Vera closed the ledger. "Plot 14 is in good sun. Morning light until about 1. That's your best bet for tomatoes." She turned to help the next person in line. Carol walked to plot 14. She stood in front of the rectangle of earth, which was dry and weedy and full of possibility, and she felt something land quietly in the middle of her chest. Not joy exactly, something quieter and more durable than joy. She came back the next Saturday. Vera was at the table. They spoke briefly about soil pH and the importance of not overwatering early. The Saturday after that, Vera came and stood at the edge of Carol's plot for a few minutes and looked at what she was doing. "Too deep," she said, pointing at a hole Carol was making. "Seeds aren't trying to go to China. They're trying to get to the light." She walked away. Carol adjusted the depth. They never had a long conversation. They never sat down together over coffee or talked about feelings or marriages or debt. But over the course of those Saturday mornings, Vera said things, small things, tools and soil things, that somehow carried a second meaning underneath them, like a current under still water. And Carol felt them accumulating in her the way nutrients accumulate in good earth, slowly and without ceremony, until one day something can grow there that couldn't before. The first lesson arrived the morning Carol got on her knees in front of plot 14 and put her hands into the dirt. She had not touched real earth in years. The sensation was strange at first, and then deeply familiar, the way your body remembers something your mind forgot. She was digging out the old weeds, the deep-rooted ones that had been there all winter, and it was harder than she expected. Her hands hurt, her knees hurt. She was sweating in the April morning cool. And she thought, This is what starting over actually feels like. It doesn't feel like inspiration. It feels like pulling weeds with your hands. It feels exactly this unglamorous and this necessary. And if you stop, because it's hard, you will never have anything but hard ground. She did not stop. The second lesson came through a phone call she made that she had been avoiding for 4 months. She called a legal aid organization about the loan Ray had taken in her name. She had been telling herself she couldn't afford a lawyer, which was true, and that there was nothing to be done, which turned out to be not entirely true. The intake coordinator walked her through options she hadn't known existed, including disputing her signature on the loan documentation, which would take time and was not guaranteed but was a real path, not a fantasy. She had been so certain the wall was solid that she had never tried the door. When she hung up the phone, she sat for a moment understanding something that Vera had said weeks before, offhandedly, about a section of the garden that had seemed barren. Sometimes the ground looks dead because it's been compacted. Aerate it, let it breathe. You'll be surprised what was waiting underneath. The third lesson came from the most unlikely direction. Ms. Herrera, the assistant principal, who had delivered the reclassification news, stopped by the cafeteria one afternoon when it was quiet to ask Carol something about the allergy protocol for the following year. They ended up talking for 20 minutes. And somewhere in that conversation, Carol mentioned, without planning to, that she had worked with children in food service for almost 2 decades and had some thoughts about the lunch program redesign. Ms. Herrera went quiet. Then she said, "Why haven't you said anything?" "Nobody asked," Carol said. Ms. Herrera looked at her for a moment with an expression Carol couldn't quite read. "I'm asking now." What followed was a choice that felt, in the moment, impossibly weighted. Ms. Herrera invited Carol to participate in an advisory group for the lunch program changes. It would mean some evening meetings. It would mean putting her name and her ideas into a space where they could be agreed with or disagreed with or ignored. It would mean being visible in a way that she had stopped being for a very long time. The safe choice was to say no. To stay behind the line, behind the tray, behind the role she knew. Nobody could judge what she didn't offer. The unsafe choice was to say yes and find out whether what she knew and had learned and had observed for 19 years was worth something. She said yes on a Wednesday and spent the rest of that day waiting to feel certain she'd made the right call. The certainty never came. What came instead was a low, steady hum of being alive in a way she hadn't been in a while, which she decided was close enough. The fourth lesson arrived at the garden on a Saturday in May. Carol's tomato plants had been doing well, and then they hadn't. 3 of them developed a yellowing at the lower leaves that she didn't understand. She'd been watering them. She'd done everything she thought she was supposed to do. Vera came and looked. "Overwatering," she said. "You're giving them so much that the roots can't breathe." Carol looked at the plants. "I was trying to help them." Vera looked at her, just for a moment, just long enough. "Sometimes," she said, "you help by pulling back." She moved on to the next plot. Carol stood there for a while. She thought about Ray. She thought about how much she had poured into that marriage when it was failing. More money, more patience, more accommodation, more of herself, as though the solution to a leaking vessel was to keep filling it. She thought about the ways she had overwatered things her whole life, given so relentlessly that she had drowned the roots of her own needs in the process. She reduced the watering. The plants recovered. In June, the legal aid dispute returned a result she had not let herself hope for. The signature on the loan documentation had inconsistencies. The matter was not fully resolved. The process would continue, but there was enough to challenge the full amount of Carol's liability. Her attorney, a young man at the legal aid office who appeared to take her case with genuine interest, told her that in a likely best-case outcome, she would owe closer to $3,000 than $9,000. And that a payment plan was possible. She was sitting on Gwen's pull-out sofa when she got the call. She said thank you 4 times. She hung up. She sat there for a moment in the quiet apartment. Gwen was at work. The house was still. Through the window, she could see the backyard where Gwen's hydrangeas were doing their June blue thing, enormous and extravagant, and completely certain of themselves. Carol pressed both hands flat on her knees and said out loud, to no one at all, "Okay, there it is. Not the end of the problem, not a rescue. Just a door where there had been a wall, opening a crack, letting in a thin line of something she had almost stopped believing was still there." The fifth lesson, the one about patience, had been taught to her entirely by the garden, by the weeks of nothing visible happening above the soil while everything necessary was happening underneath. By the way you cannot rush a root system. By the way the tomatoes turned red on their own schedule, not hers, and were perfect when they were ready, and would have been ruined if she had picked them earlier, just because she was tired of waiting. She had been a person who braced for the worst as a form of self-protection, who assumed that hope was just disappointment that hadn't arrived yet. The garden, with its absolute indifference to her anxiety and its quiet insistence on growing anyway, had started to teach her a different way of waiting, not passive, not resigned, but patient in the active sense, the way a farmer is patient, doing the daily work, and then trusting the process she cannot see. The sixth lesson came from Jasmine. Carol had mentioned the garden during one of the Sunday calls, casually, expecting nothing. Jasmine had asked a follow-up question, then another. 2 Sundays later, she asked if she could come visit and see it. She drove up from Austin on a Saturday in late June and spent 3 hours at Plot 14 with Carol, weeding and asking questions about the peppers and eating a tomato directly off the vine, still warm from the sun, and saying with her mouth full, "Mom, this is the best thing I've ever eaten." It was a small moment. It was one of the best mornings Carol could remember. She understood, kneeling in the dirt beside her daughter, that she had been waiting for her life to be put back together before she invited anyone into it. She had been treating her current circumstances as a waiting room, a temporary state to endure until the real life resumed. But this, right now, her hands in the earth and her daughter beside her, and the smell of tomato leaves in the Texas summer air, this was the real life. It was already happening. She had almost missed it by waiting for better conditions. The 7th lesson was about being seen. The advisory group for the lunch program met 4 times over the summer. Carol came to each one. She spoke when she had something to say and stayed quiet when she didn't. And what she said was grounded in 19 years of watching children eat, which turned out to be the most useful perspective in the room. By the 3rd meeting, Ms. Herrera was directing questions to her specifically. By the 4th, 2 of her suggestions had been formally included in the redesign plan. After the last meeting, a younger cafeteria worker named Tanya pulled her aside in the parking lot and said, "I didn't know you had all that in you." Carol looked at her. "I didn't either," she said. "I had to stop hiding it." The 8th lesson was the last one, and it came quietly on an ordinary morning. She had been at the garden since before the other gardeners arrived. It was early July, and the light was doing what Texas summer light does in the morning, going gold and serious all at once. Carol was checking the peppers. The thin red ones, the ones she had grown from seeds she had ordered online, after describing them to every plant vendor she could find, until one of them said, "Yes, those are a type called Cayenne d'Arbol. I can get you those seeds." She picked one. Small, thin, starting to blush from green to red at the tip. She held it in her palm. Her grandmother's pepper, growing in soil she had worked with her own hands, in a garden that cost $20, in a city where she had thought she was finished. She stood there in the early light and felt, without trying to name it, the specific feeling of having kept faith with yourself through a season that gave you very little reason to. That was the lesson. It didn't have a simple sentence. It was just, you stayed. When everything said to give up, you stayed. And here is what stayed with you. By September, the pull-out sofa was in the past. Carol had found a studio apartment, not the one from the listing months ago, a different one, smaller, with a true south-facing window and a ground floor unit with a small concrete patio just large enough for 3 large planters. The legal process with the loan was ongoing, but her demonstrated liability had been reduced enough that she had a payment plan she could actually meet on her cafeteria salary, even at the reduced part-time hours that began in September as scheduled. She moved in on a Saturday in late August with Jasmine's help and Gwen's van and a collection of items that fit into that smaller space better than she had expected, because she had spent the summer learning the difference between what she needed and what she'd been carrying out of habit. She brought the suitcases, she brought the kitchen box, she brought the seeds, the ones she'd saved from the best peppers of the summer in a small envelope she kept in her coat pocket. She left some things at Gwen's. She left, quietly, the part of herself that believed she had to have everything solved before she deserved to occupy space. On the first morning in the new apartment, she made coffee and brought it to the concrete patio and stood in the early sun. The planters weren't there yet. The soil wasn't there yet. It was just concrete and light and her, with her cup, alone and unencumbered in the specific way you only feel when you have arrived somewhere after a long journey and the journey was real. At work, the restructuring had created unexpected opportunities. 2 of the full-time staff had chosen to take early retirement packages, and the positions were being backfilled. Carol, with her participation in the advisory group now on record, was offered a shift lead position that restored her to full-time hours and came with a small increase in her hourly rate. She accepted it. Tanya, the younger worker, who had spoken to her in the parking lot, trained under her the following month. Carol found that she liked teaching, that the same instinct that had told her which child needed an extra role without being asked also told her which trainee needed encouragement and which one needed a clear correction and which one just needed to be left alone to figure it out. She still went to the garden on Saturdays. Her plot now had a small wooden sign at the edge that she had made herself, painted in neat letters. C. Simmons, Plot 14. Her name, on a piece of ground, hers. Jasmine came up from Austin one more time before the season ended, and this time she brought her roommate, who had never grown anything in her life and wanted to learn. Carol spent 2 hours with them, teaching the things Vera had taught her, the depth, the light, the difference between killed and neglected. After they left, she sat on the bench near the garden entrance and thought about what it had taken to arrive here, at this ordinary Saturday, in this unremarkable community garden in a mid-sized Texas town, feeling, for the first time in as long as she could honestly remember, like she belonged inside her own life. Vera came past on her way out, canvas bag over her arm. She glanced at Carol on the bench. "Good season?" she said. "Yes," Carol said. "Better than I expected." Vera nodded once. She was already moving toward the gate. "Next year, plant them earlier," she said. "The peppers, give them more time." She was gone before Carol could respond. Carol sat there smiling at the fence for a full minute. October, and the community garden was winding down for the season. Most plots were cleared out, the soil turned and mulched for winter, and the Saturday traffic had thinned to a handful of committed gardeners dealing with late-season cold crops. Carol was winterizing her plot when she noticed the woman at the sign-up table. Vera was not there today. It was a younger volunteer handling registration, and the woman standing at the table had the posture of someone who is trying to hold themselves together in a public space and not doing it quite as well as they think. She was maybe 49, 50. She had come in her work clothes, scrubs, and she had the look of someone who had driven here from a place of some desperation and was now standing at a table about community garden plots, wondering whether this was as foolish as it felt. Carol came over. "First time?" she said. The woman looked at her, slightly startled. "Is it that obvious?" "I was you 6 months ago," Carol said. "I stood right there, and it felt strange and necessary at the same time." The woman's name was Patricia. She was a dietary aide at the regional hospital, she said. 22 years at the same facility. She had just found out her position was being reclassified. She was living with her daughter temporarily. She had some debt she was trying not to look directly at. Carol listened. When Patricia finished, she didn't give her a speech. She didn't lay out a plan or a list of steps. She just said, "What's one thing you know how to do that nobody else around you does?" Patricia thought about it. "I make really good bread," she said slowly. "From scratch, my grandmother taught me." Carol nodded. "Start there," she said. Patricia looked at her. "That's it?" "That's everything," Carol said. "Find the thing that's yours, something nobody can reclassify. Grow that first." They stood in the October light for a moment. The trees at the edge of the garden were turning yellow and rust, and a particular amber that only Texas October produces, brief and serious and beautiful. "It takes longer than you want it to," Carol said, "and it works faster than you think it will. Both things are true." She walked Patricia over to the sign-up table. She stood with her while she chose a plot for spring. She told her about Plot 14, which would be available again next season if she wanted it, south-facing, good morning light, good for tomatoes. Patricia wrote down her information and folded her plot number into her pocket. As they parted at the garden gate, Patricia said, "Did someone do this for you?" Carol thought about a woman in a sun hat with a yellow ribbon and eyes that had been paying close attention for a long time. "Someone said 5 words," she said. "That was enough." She walked back to her plot to finish winterizing. She turned the soil carefully, the way Vera had shown her, working in the compost she'd been building since spring. She pressed the last of the mulch into place. She stood up. Her back ached. Her hands were dirty. The October air was doing that Texas thing where it finally decides to be fall and commits to it all at once. She looked at the cleared bed, ready for winter, ready for whatever came next. She reached into her coat pocket. The envelope of seeds was there, the ones she had saved from the best pepper of the summer, thin-walled and red, and exactly her grandmother's. She was going to plant them earlier next year. She was going to give them more time. "Before I let you go today, I want to ask you something, and I want you to really sit with it. Have you ever felt like the world had reclassified you? Not officially, not with paperwork, but in the quiet way it does, in the way people stop asking your opinion, in the way your name stops mattering in rooms it used to matter in the way you start to believe that maybe this smaller version of your life is simply what you deserve? Have you ever been so buried in someone else's damage that you forgot what it felt like to put your hands in the dirt for something that was just yours? If any of that is true right now, here is what I want you to do. Go to the comments and write DIA1, and then tell me one thing, just one, that you are going to do today for yourself. Something small, something real, something that belongs to no one but you. I am going to read every single one of those comments, and I mean that from the bottom of my heart. And if Carol's story stayed with you today, if something about a woman on a pull-out sofa who got on her knees and put her hands in the dirt reminded you of your own unplanted seeds, please don't leave without subscribing. Hit the bell. Come back next week. Every week we have a new story waiting for you about a woman who had every reason to give up and found one better reason not to. Each like you give this video carries it to one more woman who needs to hear her name said out loud. Share this today with someone who is sleeping on their own version of a pull-out sofa, figuratively or literally, waiting for conditions to improve before they allow themselves to begin. You already have what you need. You just have to give it somewhere to grow.